Welcome to Rambling with Resolveera. And in today's episode, we are very, very happy to have Miss Billye Jones with us. She is a great friend. Just realized that we have each other as our friends since 2017. I know Billye through the NASW, National Association for Social Workers, New York State chapter, and Billye was the person who actually introduced me to the Diversity Committee. Thank you, Billye, for that introduction, because, that has completely changed my perspective about the way social workers advocate for diversity issues. So there's like a double thank you situation here, because that is one thank you, but another thank you is to accept this offer of being my guest speaker today, because we are going to talk about a very, very important topic, child protection, child safety. April is the month where we focus on child protection, and Billye is a recent author of her book that we are going to talk about.
Billye's book is titled We Can Prevent Child Sexual Abuse, a guide for parents and caregivers, and is linked in the description down below.
In this episode as well, and Billye is going to talk about her book as well. But before I go on talking about Billye, because it's not going to end, she's that kind of a person, I want Billye to take over and please tell our viewers about yourself, about your work, and how did you get into being an author, your social work life? Tell us about yourself.
Okay, first I want to say thank you so much for inviting me. And I have to say, I also consider you a friend. I have enjoyed every moment, the talks that we've had, the time that we've been to connect and about sort of the important issues that go on in the field, and just even talking about family and everyday life. So it's just been such a privilege, and I have learned so much from you as well. So I'm so excited to be here. I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about child abuse prevention. So I'm so grateful that you invited me and giving me the space today. A little bit about me. It's so hard to talk about yourself and introduce yourself. So I will say that I am a social worker in New York State. I have been in the field for 20 plus years now. Throughout my entire social work career, I have worked with vulnerable populations, children, adolescents, and adults, many who have experienced trauma, specifically child sexual abuse and sexual violence. I have had, and I call it a privilege to do this work, I have had the privilege of working with child sexual abuse. I ran a child sexual abuse program in New York City and the Bronx for many years. I've done community-based demonstrations projects for violence intervention. I've done direct service, currently in private practice, working with children and adult survivors of child sexual abuse. I've worked on policy related to sexual abuse prevention. I've trained. So it has been such a privilege. And, I feel that I've also been somewhat successful to get other social workers, younger social workers, to care about the issue. I've trained people. So I've had so many different experiences doing that. And one of the reasons why I wrote the book, it took, people say, "Oh, you wrote a book." It took several years to work on it. But the inspiration for it is really listening to survivors that I had worked with over time. And you see the patterns. And even though people are from different places around the world, different identities, different cultures, you hear some of the same patterns about the misconceptions and the myths, and them sharing what they wish that their family members knew, people in their community knew, talking about the myths and stereotypes that we still have about who abuses children. So that was the inspiration, like seeing these terrible patterns and saying, okay, I want to put this together in a way to educate parents about what the real risks are, trying to shatter and address some of the stereotypes and myths that I really think keep children unsafe. So that was the inspiration, is just doing the work and seeing the patterns and hearing from survivors. This is what I wish was different. I wish I could have said something. I wish that when I did say something, people believed me or listened to me. Or a lot of young men and boys, for example, say, I didn't know boys could get hurt, right? No one ever told me that. So that was why I did it. And one of the hardest things I think I might have done to date was to try to put all this in a book.
But you did an excellent job. I want to put this up on the screen here for our viewers. This is a great read. I have my copy from Billye. It's available on Amazon. You can get it. You can read it. This is like simple language, but it's a very important message. And we will be revisiting the book back and forth during this episode. So Billye, as you were saying that people don't know, the whole purpose of this book is to spread awareness. Is it says that it's a guide for parents and caregivers. And when you say it's guide, it means that it's there to discuss, it's there to share the information. And what you explained, that people didn't know or people were not aware, it also kind of segues into the fact that this topic is kind of under discussed. It's
Yes.
kind of avoided, right?
Yes.
But sexual abuse of vulnerable children, like sexual abuse of children, it's a big concern. And it's not just a community, it's not like at a micro level, it's like macro. It's a big problem, right? It's across the
Yes.
globe.
Yes.
It's there in every country, it's there in every community, yet people don't talk about it, people don't discuss about it. It's so under discussed. Why do you think it is like that? Why does this topic, being such a big concern, doesn't get the due importance, or is like it's always there in a blind side or avoided? Why do you
Yes.
think? Like, we all probably know it, but I want to sound the why from this episode, because I want people to know why it is not. It's very important to address this.
Okay. So there are so many reasons, and we could spend this whole this question, but I will try to give some highlights. One is you actually mentioned it in your question. One is that people see this often as like, that's a family problem, it's an individual problem. People don't see it as a global problem, right? Or they don't see it as a problem in a community. I tell people, even people who are advocates for children, I said, if you go to a typical elementary school classroom and there are 25 students in there, 4 or 5 of them either have been abused or can be, right? We're talking about 1 in 4 girls in the United States. That number is pretty similar globally, depending on what metrics you're looking at. And boys, it used to be 1 in 6. Now the statistic in the United States is 1 in 13. I still, just based on the work that I've done, I think the numbers between boys and girls is very similar. But I think we individualize it as a family problem. So that's one. I think another challenge is that we have decided that people who harm children are like monsters and they're terrible, right? And they're the worst of the worst. So people don't think that they know somebody who might have caused harm, right? They're like, those are for those people, or they're all in jail, or they're, so that's part of it too. We're not able to see what's in front of us. The other thing is there are so many myths and so many ways that we're not educating children. The number one myth that is a persistent problem, and it has been since we've been talking about child sexual abuse somewhat openly starting in the 70s and in the 80s. The myth of the stranger danger, right?
Mm-hmm.
We tell children to beware of strangers. And we communicate that that is the biggest threat that they will face. And yes, abuse by strangers happens, but statistically, it's pretty insignificant. But when we have this conversation, parents are like, beware of strangers. There's children's books, beware of strangers. If something does happen in a community, that's the thing that's on the news. And the reality is that 90% of children are going to know who harmed them, right? And stranger is very rare. So parents spend a lot of their time talking about that. Children, I will say, because I know this is always a question, children actually have a pretty great track record. They really do know what to do when there is a stranger. So there is that. We spend a lot of our time and we don't prepare children to talk about safety and some vulnerabilities about people that they know. So that's another one. The other thing too is we say that beware of adult men typically, right? Women do cause harm. They can cause harm. And a lot of harm, unfortunately, comes from youth under 18, a pretty large percentage, about 40%. So we're not having the conversations. The other thing that we are uncomfortable with is talking to children about body parts and consent and boundaries and safety. There are many parents who feel that if you talk about correct names of body parts, that you are over sexualizing your children or that it's taboo. So we have that as a continued problem.
It's like sowing the seeds, making them like deliberately putting the thoughts in their mind. That's sometimes like I've come
Yes.
across
Yeah.
parents and
Yeah.
families who believe that if I'm talking about it with my child, it's like I'm making my child aware in a wrong way. Like I'm putting thoughts
Right.
in my mind. My child will start thinking about it. Right now, my child
Right.
is like happy and not thinking. But
Right.
that's
Right.
that's
Right.
like, misinterpreting the awareness.
Right. Absolutely. And when you can tell children the names of their body parts in a very matter-of-fact way, when you're teaching other body parts, you just keep going, right? It's funny, a lot of adults, I feel like we project our beliefs on children and some of those fears. So those are other ways. And then unfortunately, I think we have so many survivors of abuse who have not been believed or taken seriously. And so we also have a culture of silence. And we also, and I know that we don't do these things purposely, but we have gotten to the point that we are teaching children to take care of themselves and protect themselves. And what I mean by that is that we have child abuse prevention workshops at schools, which is very important. Good touch, bad touch. I'm an advocate for all of it, so I don't want anybody to get that impression. But we don't have the same level of education for the adults and for the teachers, right? And for those who are supposed to protect. So sometimes you have a child in a situation, they may know that something is happening or they want to disclose, and sometimes the adults don't understand. And my last point, because like I said, we could continue to go on just on this
Absolutely.
question. Many people still don't understand what grooming is, right? And how someone who is grooming a child to be abused starts non-contact abuse first, does subtle things. And sometimes if more adults were aware of what that was and what that looked like, we could interrupt a lot of things before they start. But I feel like that's also a big piece of the puzzle, because even parents who I find who are, do everything that I would say in the guide and, are pretty confident and are talking to children about their body parts and boundaries, sometimes still don't know the grooming. I had a situation where I was training professionals, and I was talking about grooming as a presentation. And somebody came up to me at the end and said, I believe my child is being groomed. I had not really heard of this information, like I didn't know about this. And so I had given her some immediate things to do, literally when she walked out of the door, to make some changes and adjustments. But I think that's also a big issue that is not discussed, and I did make it a point to address it in the book, because it's, there are situations where a child is being groomed, something is happening, but they had never been physically touched, right? And then a parent may suspect something and say, oh my goodness. And then they approach the child and say, okay, who touched you? Who did this and who did that? And the child is going to say nobody touched them, right? Because that's the truth and that's really what is going on. But the parent doesn't realize, right? Which leads me
it's like the emotional and the mental aspect of abuse versus the physical aspect of the abuse, because what you are explaining through the factor of grooming is more emotional and mental piece of the abuse, because it's like the preparation, building that trust, creating that environment mentally for the child and emotionally, that the child becomes weaker and emotionally dependent on the perpetrator.
Right, absolutely. And some parents figure out that something is happening, but they ask the wrong questions because we do feel like, or we're taught or believe that child sexual abuse is only physical, right? We're not thinking about the other ways, the exposure to pornography, having children, having pictures taken of them, exposed to talk or lewd acts, or watching things. So you can have a child being groomed, and because we're not asking the right questions and we're not clear about what we're looking for, that it does continue, unfortunately, until the worst happens. So that's another challenge.
So this is a great segue into our third question, Billye, because you mentioned both professionals and parents. You mentioned that it's a stereotype, it's a deep rooted thinking that if somebody is abusing the child, and if it's the parent, then they are monsters, and it doesn't happen in our community. I not as long as a time span like you, but I was working at some point in my early social work career as a child protection case worker, was in a subcontract with ACS, and we were I was working with immigrant families and communities which had language proficiency challenges, financial, socioeconomic challenges. One thing that came up again and again, and unfortunately, I've been attending, continuing education workshops recently, focusing on child protection services, the challenges, how social workers or professionals in the child protection services are viewed by the community. So I want to take like a little turn around your answer to the second question and turn it towards the third question, where another aspect of this work is where child protection workers or people who are working with child protection services are viewed as culturally not competent, not kind-hearted, very challenging to come by, difficult to communicate with, come in with a stereotypical thinking, view the family, the victim, the family, or the victim's family in a completely different light. And it's very hard to have them everybody on the same page, like, you know, when we have those meetings and family meetings, you see that tension.
Yes,
You feel
absolutely.
that, you know, that fire building up, and it's like, you know, something is going to happen, there's some eruption going to happen. And it's very difficult, because the word, lack of any other word, I would say, people working with child protection are seen as insensitive,
Yes.
culturally incompetent. That's a
Mhm.
big challenge. You've been in this field for so long, Billye. Have you experienced that when you were working with families? Why does that happen, and how do you address this challenge? Because unless we have like everybody on the same page, how are we going to solve this issue?
Right. So absolutely. There is a lot of bias in the system, and it's not just us women of color talking about this. The data backs it up, right?
Hmm.
Unfortunately, right? So if anybody's listening, it's like, oh, that's their opinion. It's like, nope, you know, there's facts, right? We can back all this up, right?
Exactly.
Um, you know, there is just so much, and it's so complicated. And because we have the systems that we have, that's another barrier to preventing abuse in very real ways. And again, that's a whole other like show, right, that we could talk about.
Exactly.
But um, I think the system really needs to be reworked. But I do think that there are, you know, we have guidelines that are from a Western perspective, just even to start, right?
Mhm.
And certain views about, and certain beliefs built in about what is child, how things are supposed to be, right? Child welfare systems are pretty unique in the United States. I know they don't exist in other places around the world. So then you also have that, you know, that people come here, right, to this system where they did not have one. I also think that um, when we are working with families from different places around the world, and I'm veering from child protective for 1 second, and then I'll come right back. We don't, I don't know. I think we make a lot of assumptions. We don't ask questions. We don't try to understand different cultures and families and family patterns. I have found when I've worked with families to say, okay, well, this is how child abuse is viewed here. These are some of the practices. This is why there might be concerns. I find that that's a better way to work than just reporting everything. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um, but there's a lot of implicit bias in the system. I think the systems were not designed to deal with the tens of thousands and millions of children, right? It was supposed to be a last ditch, like no other options or alternatives. And now we have, for example, over 400,000 children in the United States in foster care.
Oh my gosh.
Um, so the systems weren't designed for that. I think when you look at leadership and the decision makers and the policy makers, they don't reflect the people that they are making policies for and decisions for. Um, we have seen over time, and I can talk about New York and New York City, that if a woman, for example, was a victim of domestic violence, her children would be removed, right? And the onus would be put on her to protect herself and the family, right? And very little would be done about the abuser and the person who causes harm. I think the other thing is that just due to racism and discrimination and believing that certain people don't know how to take care of their children, there's been a refusal to address some of the systematic challenges. Um, So we punish a lot of parents because they're poor, right? They don't have the resources, and they get neglect cases because they're struggling to put food on the table, or they don't have the right things that their children need, or they can't pay to follow up with medicines and medication. And so we have used Child Protective Services to, I think, address poverty in many cases.
So,
Um,
so I was thinking that DEI would be like one of the major things that needs to like get into the system to understand, because I believe that the 400,000, the number that you said of children in foster care, are from each and every community around the world, and
yes,
they cannot be seen through just one lens.
right,
There has to be the DEI lens included in it.
right.
So how do you think that that's going to help? Because you've been in the DEI for so long and you've been an active advocate of DEI.
Right. I think the challenges that we still have, it's like on paper, people will say racism is wrong, discrimination is wrong. Yes, we have the data. We haven't done enough on implicit bias training. And I also think when we train and recruit people, I don't know if we're screening, and I don't have the answer, but I don't know if we're screening to really assess implicit bias. I
Mm.
don't think that's part of how we recruit. So we have a problem with, we say, deal with the inequities in the system, but yet we still have the challenges, right, of who is hired, who is recruited, what implicit bias training that you have. How do you feel about the communities that you work in? Um, there's always been a big debate about whether it's better to have somebody outside. I think that we think about that child protective really reflects people globally, right? And if it does, because I know in New York City, the leadership has gotten more diverse, but I don't know if they really are decision makers around policy and cultural competency. I also think the system is not necessarily designed to really build relationships with families. They all often come in when there is a problem. I think some of the investment should really be sort of outside of child protective, to have real supports for families that are not tied to child welfare. Like if you're an overwhelmed parent and you want preventive services, which that's where I also worked, and I didn't mention that before. So that is seen as in the program that I worked, a lot of referrals came from ACS. We don't set it up where a parent can be like, I'm overwhelmed, I'm struggling, or I don't have the resources, right? It's very difficult in the United States to just say, okay, I need additional services and support without it being criminalized, without it being judged, without having to engage in systems. I think we need to do more for parents with young children in particular, because half of children in foster care are below 5, right? I
Mhm.
know that we think, and it's true, we do have older youth and older children in care, but we're really failing families with children from 0 to 5, and that's especially true when you think about aspects of DEI and understanding families and building relationships and having supports in communities and dealing with structural inequities, right? It's like, it's my goal and my wish that we could do all the things so we wouldn't even have to think about all the children who are in child welfare, right? Like we should want to prevent things that before they happen. But I feel like in the United States, we tend to be more reactive after something has happened, right? And it's like
Right.
we need to deal with all the stuff before. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
That does. So we have like last 4 5 minutes. So we are at the end of this episode. Being an author, being a social worker, a DE and I advocate, what would be your message for our viewers and our listeners today on child protection? Of course, my message is like, read Billye's book. That's my message. What's yours?
Yeah. Yeah. So I will say, one of the things in the book that I do think is helpful is their discussion guides and really questions on how to have the conversations about safety with your children. So say that. I think one of the takeaways is it's really important for us to learn the correct information about what's really going on with child sexual abuse and knowing what the risks are, shattering the stereotypes. But I also talk a lot in the book about addressing what I call generational habits. And even if I look at my own family, there are things that we were told about protecting ourselves that are like steeped in stereotypes, right? That were passed down from generation to generation. I also, as many people have, might have been raised that children should be seen and not heard, or, children don't have much power and authority, and adults are authority. So one of the things that I have asked people to consider is to think about how we talk to children about power and authority. So the example I like to give is, we walk into a family event with a small child, right? And the child is often told that they have to hug and kiss everybody, or greet everybody, whether they want to or not, right? And how in some ways we teach children very early, and I know we don't mean to, that they don't get a choice. Their body, doesn't belong to them. Anybody can hug and kiss and touch them. But if we're adults, we wouldn't want that. We wouldn't want people just approaching us and hugging us and having to kiss everybody in the room. So I think, feeling more comfortable, yes, about education about body parts and all that stuff, but allowing children to say no, right? And also for us to think about, children don't understand when we say you have to listen to this person, no matter what they say or do, especially if they're a grandparent or an uncle or an aunt or something like that. They don't know that you mean, oh, listen to them until they tell you to do something wrong, right? I think we have to really consider, how we educate children around authority. And that's, I talk about that a lot in the book because I do feel like that's a big piece of the puzzle as well.
Right. So thank you so much, Billye, for your insights and for your, for the book that you have given to the community, to the world. It's globally available on Amazon. So thank you for all the information that you shared with us. This is so very important. One thing that I definitely take from our conversation is the grooming part that you mentioned. That's something that just keeps going off everybody's head, regardless professionals or families.
Yes.
I really appreciate, and I would say that we would continue this conversation. This is not the first and the last time that we'll have you here as a speaker. This is definitely the first time, but not the last time. I would like to, talk more about child protection, diversity with you, and we look forward to more such, conversations with you. So thank you so much for being here today.